Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Have you had lunch? Actually, I found one restaurant managed by Joseon Hospital. It offers a good food. Have you ever been there? Actually, we have several locations to serve lunch or dinner. I once read the statistics about reputation, uh, uh, which location restaurant is best. Okay? We have Glover House and a Solmaru, Joseon Hospital. How do you taste the food offered by our faithful maid and great chef? So you can see in the backdrop a few pictures which I prepared to promote your comprehension of this lecture. To continue on the lesson, the low dennings, a traditional loaf, and other core tools to dress him up. And the next picture shows a new leader of a British Labour Party, was called at Midland. Now, in Great Britain, the Prime Minister's background is from a Conservative Party, whose name is Gordon Brown. And it is usual practice to switch in regular interval between two parties. And previously, Tony Blair served a Prime Minister leading a Labour Party. Very young and promising. Picture shown. And I've excerpted one newspaper article which shows the plaque leading to a majestic court. It is Adelaide, and Common, who should be a popularity in Great Britain, was tried in this majestic court. As we have learned later, the majestic unique they were administered by layperson. The justice is executed by not a professional judges, rather, and it has a long tradition, well traced back to the Wars of Crusade in 13th centuries. And Admiral Master may disqualify himself from sentencing a command because letters elicited from the man. James Pat Nolan, 61, has admitted conning 3 victims into giving him hundreds of thousands of dollars for a fake offshore investment scam. The call was due to his sentencing submissions. Magistrate Joseph Baldino said 2 letters elicited from Nolan may lead him to feel compromised, disqualifying himself from hearing the matter. In the British legal system, the tradition and culture of judges are a little distinctive, since they are very faithful and engaged in trial proceedings more extensively and in enthusiasm, like the United States and our Court of Judges. And in the one culture, the point of comparison for our understanding of a British legal system. And the next picture shows the people of House of Lords. The article bears the title, House of Lords Too Small, with a 300 peers. As you see later, there are over 1,000 member, and House of Lords, who are in part on hereditary basis, and it is subject to amenable to succession, and other parts of a members just a lifetime tenure. And there are also some group of bishops who is religious people and represents the tradition of a curial redress. In history, the Prime Minister, for example, Margaret Thatcher, offers a number of seats to make a peerage in support of his political leadership in some cases. And in the last scene, you can see the Court of Justice of the European communities. England is a later member for which was to enter European community a little later. And in any case, Great Britain is subject to the jurisdiction of a European Court of Justice. And actually, as I've introduced, the European law is higher law, and theoretically is dictated to govern each national laws. But the practical context is a little delicate and complicated, which in some cases may some of a diversion, not at the extent of a contravening the European hierarchy, but practically may be distorted, or in some cases avoided technically or shrewdly from the jurisdiction of a European law. It shows the scene. You can see an exquisite scene. The Dominique Barrault, who is architect from Paris, designed the construction. Okay, and so we start in page 297, and our turn is to review the Parliament and a Prime Minister, which is constitutional in terms of our discussion purpose, and also we have to see some core system which is comprehensive. Actually, I prepared some chart to show the diagram of a court hierarchy and the network on flow. It disappeared. What happened? I'm sorry. I'll later get it available for your reference. The politics of Great Britain is unique, where it involves some intra-practices within the political party, House of Lords and House of Commons. And the selection of Prime Minister is not official in process, rather confidential and conducted in secret basis, in which practice they can be more intimate, and some dynamism of loyalty may well be cherished in context. And you can see the appointment power of Prime Minister, about a leader of House and a Speaker of House, and also we call other members of Congress whips, who are not charged with any official title other than a membership in Congress. So, legislation is adopted by the House of Commons, considered by the House of Lords, and given royal consent by the sovereign. Thus, it is important to include the sovereign within the definition of Parliament as a whole. But royal assent must be given. The sovereign really has no choice. The assent is required by a convention that has endured since 1640, and the legislative role of the House of Lords has diminished in the century. Legislative power thus is formally lodged in the House of Commons or lower house. But even the Commons is subject to control by the Cabinet, where the most executive base of power exists. So fundamentally, the British politics adopt the institution of Parliament system. They exercise the state power largely based on two branches of Commons. And when we discuss the constitutional issues for a specific country, we have to forcefully identify the sovereign, the logic of sovereignty, for example. But it's symbolic. Later, you can see some introduction about a British Constitution, English Constitution, where also by a Bazet, he held the view that there is a significant shift from a sovereign power to House of Commons. For example, the king or queen in England has no power about lesser veto, and also the executive power was enormously deprived in a practical extent or a context. Actually, when the United States adopted the Constitution in late 18th century, they seriously explored the context of a British politics, where the sovereignty is placed. King George III or Lord North. Actually, we call the government at the time the government of Lord North, but is it exactly true? Actually, the king's third dominance is stuck to pursue the war on a very strenuous ground, and he persists to struggle to suppress the colonial state. What does it imply? So, the presidency of the United States was created in assimilation of a British politics. So now you can see the constitutional power, which is very fundamental to describe the presidency, kind of a king's role. Right? For example, a veto power is significant. Was normally entertained by the monarch in traditional politics, and also the executive power was vested in the presidency of the United States. One other notion distinguishable from veto power may be a congressional veto. In modern politics, the Congress of the United States occasionally enact some statute which provide power of a veto within the preserve of Congress. Is it permissible? Once it was debated in the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that it is unconstitutional and contrary to the command of separation of powers principle. So the veto power in the court terms cannot be reserved or assured within the context of Congress. On the contrary, the President has a veto power to reject the bills. So you can see the dynamism in comparison with the United States Constitution in some cases. So lack of a true bicameral legislature has generated recent discussion of parliamentary reform, directed largely to increasing the power of the House of Lords. So the British Congress, a British Parliament, adopted a bicameralism, but that is distinguishable from true bicameralism. The principal function of the House of Commons, and indeed that of Parliament as a whole, is to enact laws for the overall benefit of the nation. No one should deny that the lawmaking function of the House of Commons is of a considerable importance. We sometimes say it had a bad year, and that a few needed laws were passed, or that it had a good year, that needed laws were enacted. But there is another function that we tend to overlook, part because it is related to the different notion of a separation of powers in England. It is the law of the Commons to elect the government. The House of Commons choose the Prime Minister. We in the United States follow a different rule. We created the Electoral College with the idea that it would be composed of some of the most intelligent people in the nation who deliberate after the national election and choose the most able leader. But it is an anachronism as an American electoral institution and will likely be abolished at some time in the future, although perhaps only when it has functioned so as to cause national surprise or shock. The House of Commons functions quite differently. Bound to some degree by public opinion, the elected House of Commons have nevertheless chooses the nation's leader, and perhaps more importantly, may later choose to reject the leader. It is the rejection power that makes the House stand considerably apart from the American system and causes relations between the chosen Prime Minister and the House of Commons to be, if not cordial, at least frequent. The system tends to result in former Prime Ministers, a Prime Minister to lead the nation, but the House of Commons follows close behind, guiding them when it feels the leaders stray too widely. So, as of the nature of parliamentary system, both powers are concentrated in density, but inside a check and balances can be ensured in some context as later seen. Actually, I have a sore throat, and you may hear some less quality of a speech in the lecture. I'm afraid it troubles you. Is it okay? House of Commons members are elected by a plurality rather than a majority vote. It is commonly referred to as the first past the post process. It allows a relatively minor changes in voting patterns of principal parties in the electoral districts to result in meaningful changes in the power balance in Commons. The system does provide for the development of a rather close ties between members of the House and the constitutions. And party loyalty and organization are essential to the survival of the parliamentary or government party. Serious breaches in loyalty may result in House of Commons for contrary to the interests of government elected. So the terms of government depends on the event of general election. But such vote would be welcomed by the opposition party, ever prepared to confront the parliamentary party in a new election at a time of the latter's weakness. At the beginning of each parliament, a speaker is elected. He serves as chairman of the House. Sometimes this election is contested, but more often there are pre-election conferences between the parliamentary and opposition party leaders, which lead to a unanimous election. The Prime Minister appoints the leader of the House, and the opposition appoints a leader of the opposition. Other members are then selected to be whips, who maintain discipline and urge attendance, and it goes without saying loyalty in debate and vote of party members. There is far less independent voting by members than in the United States. That is also the case of Korea. We recently charted a tendency about a split, unled a vote, independently made on each context of a case by individual members. But how do you agree if it is suited to the design and expectations of a power framework? We now practice a presidential system, so there is some delicacy between both frameworks. Were it to be otherwise, the government's very existence might be threatened. Dissolution of parliament might follow the government's failure to obtain an affirmative vote on a major proposal. It might also come to an end if there is a vote of censure or particularly a poor opinion polls. If it does not die a natural birth, it will do so by lapsing after 5 years. An extension is permitted only with the concurrence of the House of Lords when there is an emergency. But if the House of Commons decide to enact a statute giving itself extended life, could it not do so if it truly sovereign? It did extend its life during the 1939, 45 period, but this was considered an emergency. By convention, Parliament would not abuse this rule, and when an extension has been decreed, it has been limited also by convention to 1 year at a time. So convention usually prevails since they have no written laws of a public matter, particularly about the government function. Of course, England also has the enhanced form of a public law, and as you see later, a court system developed through the decades, which is a little later and distinctive from more a specialized form of a tribunal, like in France. But the public law flourished also in England. But the government structure or other political interaction between the institutions, let's seriously touch it. So the convention largely prevails. The Prime Minister may choose to dissolve Parliament not only when the situation is bad, but also when it is especially good, with the hope that the people will vote the party in again and give it a new 5-year lease. So both branches have power to overhaul the executive or a parliament, and that, however, is produced in some condensed inference or interaction. So that is critically important that England has a common election, what I call general election, to select both leaders of both branches. The contrary, for the case of United States and Korea, we have independent election for the presidency and executive, and also the other branch of Congress. So a separate source of political legitimacy may be found in a presidential system, unlike the parliament system. That means some risk or a dilemma can be posed by a stalemate of arising from the conflict between the parties. For example, the latest case of sequestration in the United States can go as one example in this context. Although Parliament is to have a life of 5 years, the custom is to divide into annual sessions. They sometimes held more frequently, and when a Parliament is dissolved for reasons mentioned above, the order of division into annual sessions necessarily will be altered. The Commons does not meet for or very long each session, and although the building is impressive, the working conditions are considerably more austere than in the United States. The House of Lords is less understandable to us in America than the Commons. The House of Lords is not an elected body. The success of the old curia-regis, it has evolved from an aggregate of noblemen in the 13th century. Membership changed little for centuries. It now includes low spiritual, certain bishops, about 20-30 members, low temporal, peers and peeresses, about 1,100 of which about 340 are life, as opposed to hereditary peers. And the laws of appeal in ordinary, the laws, 11 members. It is largely conservative, but often quite adventuresome. A major change was the addition of life peers, allowed under the Life Peerages Act in 1948. Since that time, there have been relatively few grants of hereditary peerages. Another important change was effected by the Peerages Act 1963, which allowed peers to disclaim their peerage for their lifetime. But they could not disclaim it forever. It will pass to the appropriate heir at the usual time for succession. So, the House of Lords is rather a perfunctory in practical terms, but they are procedurally necessary to practice the constitutionalism. Some useful comment from Prof. Sampson, The Changing Anatomy of Britain. The article was wrote in 1982. Life peers multiply, so that by 1981 they make up 345 of the 1,178 members of the House of Lords. Every prime minister since Macmillan has found life peerage as an invariable means to reward the political friends, party benefactors, or personal cronies. Harold Wilson made 183 peers, more than anyone, and his patronage provoked a scandal by including dubious entrepreneurs and showbiz tycoons who had performed obvious public service, one of whom, Lord Kagan, later went to jail for fraud. Callaghan was more circumspect, creating only a handful of political peers, including the trade unionist Lord Scanlon. But Jack Jones, the outstanding union leader of his generation, was one of the very few men to refuse a peerage. Mr. Thatcher has been prompted than any prime minister in rewarding political allies, giving peerages not only to Tory tycoons such as Lord Sheff, Lord McAlpin, Lord Ford, and Lord Weinstock, historians such as Lord Thomas and Lord Dacre, but also to the new owner of Daily Express, Lord Matthews. Also, Matthews is one of notable historians. It's not acceptable to either the same name. I'm not sure he is a historian. To either of two major parties, the second chamber elected by PL is seen as next best thing. The problem with this, however, is that many MPs would be opposed to such a reform because the second chamber might then become a dangerous rival to the Commons itself. Why, it might be asked, should the Commons continue to be the main seat of power if it is less democratically elected than the Lords? Moreover, the adoption of PL in the Lords could make it more difficult to resist pressure for its adoption in the Commons as well. The main beneficiaries of present electoral system are the two major parties. Under PL, the Labour and Conservative parties would get fewer seats and the Liberals more. In future parliaments, the minor parties would always hold the balance of power, and one party majority government would be a thing of the past. Such a prospect naturally does not appeal to the members of major parties, and that is why they oppose PL. For this reason, there is likely to be substantial opposition to any reform of the House of Lords along these lines. If the House is reformed, however, its powers could be entrenched by suitable legislation. This would involve abolishing the power of the Crown to create new peers and providing that the Parliament Acts will not apply to any future bill affecting the powers and composition of the laws. In this way, all changes will have to be agreed to by the House of Lords itself. Then we now turn to explore briefly the Prime Minister and the Sovereign. And the pertinent parts drawn from the article Government and Law, featured in 1981, and some brief comment about the English Constitution, made by Buzzard in 1963. The Prime Minister is in an uncertain position. His importance is acknowledged, but his duration is most impermanent. The office expires at the last general election. The power of serving Prime Minister is considerable, however. He is the head of party, which is power in Parliament. The system of the leader of the House and the whips, combined with the much less powerful role of the House of Lords, gives the Prime Minister power beyond that of the United States President and most of other Western leaders. The most important distinction between the British Prime Minister and the United States President is that the Prime Minister is not elected directly by the people. The aspiring candidate must be chosen from among the leaders of the successive party in the national election for House of Commons seats, not from a public constitution. But the way prime ministers are selected differs in two principal parties. So, how in these days does he come to this position? First, he must have been a member of Conservative or the Labour Party since his youth. So, we can have some understanding, introduction about the selection of a prime minister from the article, Griffith's article. And he must have been a member of House of Commons for many years. He must, in keen competition with many of his contemporaries within his party, have shown ability in the House of Commons and sure-footedness in those slippery places where his seniors fought with one another. So, as I mentioned, the practice or convention comes into more intense play other than a written oath. So the article is very helpful to see the political dynamism and some conventional practices of the constitutional history. Let's see. He should at some points in his career either have thrown in his own lot with one of those seniors who then went from success to success, or at the very least he should have avoided close identification with others who failed. He must then pick it out for a junior office at an early age and have incurred the minimum possible displeasure from those of his contemporaries who were passed over at the same time. And when he came to top and into contest for the leadership of party, it must have been at a time when his particular qualities were thought to be preferable for lessons which might have had nothing whatever to do with himself. Obviously, then, he must also have luck. So, this way of approach is very important in view of a modern politics or a governance. For example, leadership study is now very popularized across the disciplines, particularly for the business school and a political department of political science. So, in United States, also there is study to have some derive some basics about the selection of political leaders. For example, social stratification theory suggests that there is some social classes which is more competent and most frequently breed the kind of political leaders in the United States of many meaningful public institutions, judicial posts, and a presidency and other congressmen. And there are several theories in explicatory context about selection of leadership, and one theory also suggests a overexposure context, which means the political leaders usually have many chances to experience a political agenda or issues. So their element serves to facilitate a move to the political career and could work as a basin to breed the political leaders. Have you agree? And there is no definite truth about the cross-sectors research about the selection of political leaders, but there is some rough consensus about the context of a selection, and it is also pertinent to selection of prime minister in some sense, but this article revels basically the interplay among within the Labour or Conservative Party. Actually, until 1965, the Conservative Party had no formal procedure for deciding who should be its leader. But in that year, a set of rules was adopted, and Mr. Heath was the first leader elected under those rules. They provide that the leader shall be elected by ballot, conducted amongst all the Conservative members of the House of Commons under control of chairman of the 1922 committee. Candidates must be proposed and seconded in writing, and the consent of the candidates depend on policy and legislation, sometimes referred to as the power to advise, encourage, and warn. The structure of the monarchy and activities of sovereign are governed by legislation and conventions. The sovereign does exercise royal prerogatives as the historical fountain of justice, but there is no effective remaining independent sovereign power. There are rare rumblings from Labour to abolish the monarchy, but they are not as threatening as challenges to the other remnant of vested privilege, the House of Lords. Criticism of the monarchy usually is directed to its financial burden to the nation or to the minor transgressions of subordinate members of the royal family. But on the whole, the monarchy seems quite secure, providing it does not allow use of royal prerogative to stray beyond the symbolic. As Badger and Sampson know, the role of sovereign should not be confused. So, how to term the British framework government? Fundamentally, surrounding the concept of a constitutionalism. Of course, they have no written constitution, but hypothetically and in practice about some unwritten context, we can identify some concept of English Constitution. The popular theory of the English Constitution involves two errors as to the sovereign. When we deal with the Constitution, we firstly see the context of sovereignty. We have recourse to people in general, as in the United States, popular sovereignty. We call it a popular sovereignty. Or if we have to see the source of legitimacy from a monarch, or as I've said, symbolic monarchy is practiced in communist countries. First, in its oldest form, at least, it considers him as an estate of realm, a separate coding authority with the House of Lords and the House of Commons. This and Martel's the sovereign once was, but this is no longer. The authority could only be exercised by a monarch with a lesser veto. He should be able to reject bills, if not as the House of Commons rejects them, at least as the House of Peers rejects them. So actually, the veto power has a tradition about a monarchy, a presidential power to veto the legislation, but the context is rather different, since the rationale for the policy ground to veto the bills or as the proposal, usually have to find the ground of some constitutional justification. For example, the bills may overhaul some constitutional arrangement, or the bills may not be properly designed or drafted, which brings some of a serious fiscal shortage. Or so, in some cases, the government cannot be competent to enforce the bills as drafted. So the reasons to veto the bill should be grounded on some democratic and constitutional ground, actually. But the context, of course, differs to see the practice of a monarchy in early years. But the formality is same. It goes same as I've said. So the United States Constitution may well assimilate the practice of a British politics at that time. The Queen, what we call a legislative has a dual meanings in use. For example, we can term it as a veto for president, but usually for the jurists of the United States understands this term in the context of a congressional veto, as I compared it previously. And one case involves the Charter case, which is very famous in this area of law. So the Supreme Court cited many provisions of Constitution, for example, appointment power and separation of powers principle, and other principles and basic assumptions about Constitution. For example, judicial independence, and also the true nature of each power vested in Constitution. So in that case, the Congress may not exercise a final review of a executive decision about expulsion of a foreigner. In that case, Charter was an immigrant, which has a temporary visa, and the Department of Justice has the authority to determine his status, whether to deport him to his home country or permit his stay in the United States. The Department of Justice decided the issue in the process as a preliminary measure. So in the statute enacted by the Congress, actually conferred the power of final review within the Congress. How do you agree if the arrangement is constitutional or not? So that issue was debated, and in that context we use the term legislative veto or congressional veto. So it is a delicate point in basic and constitutional aspect of nation. Fundamentally, Congress and the presidency, executive, they are actually two major political branches in the constitutional scheme. But how do you agree the power of veto in the nature? Congress can be understood to entertain that nature of power, veto power, in contrast with the presidency. So it is interesting, and without a veto power, there is some dimension of which is dysfunctional in the practices. So we use that tools, instrumentality to design the governance. For example, we have a veto system in the United Nations. So 5 permanent members of UN Security Council have the right to veto the other suggestion when it entails a compulsory action. So the area of a veto is very delicate in terms of a supremacy or sovereignty. But the Queen has no such veto. She must sign her own death warrant if the 2 houses unanimously send it up to her. It is a fiction of the past ascribed to a lesser power. She has long ceased to have any. Secondly, the ancient theory holds that the Queen is the executive. The American Constitution was made upon a most careful argument, and most of that argument assumes the king to be the administrator of the English Constitution and an hereditary substitute for him, a president, to be a peremptory necessary. Living across the Atlantic and misled by accepted doctrines, the framers of fair constitution, even after keenest attention, did not perceive the Prime Minister to be the principal executive of British Constitution and the sovereign cog in the mechanism. There is indeed much excuse for the American legislators in the history of that time. They took the idea of a constitution from the time when they encountered it. But in the so-called government of Lord North, George III was the government. Lord North was not only his appointee, but his agent. The minister carried on a war which he disapproved and hated, because it was a war which his sovereign approved and liked. Inevitably, therefore, the American Convention believed the king from whom they had suffered to be the real executive and not the minister from whom they are not suffering. So it is interesting, and actually the federal constitution is a delicate document which requires a much toils of analysis and comparison. And you can see the Federalist Papers prepared by founding fathers, particularly notable figures being a James Madison, who is called the father of Constitution in the United States, and John Jay or Alexander Hamilton, or other prominent figures. And they usually posit a very inquisitive position about the design of a competent and a competent government based on liberty concept. And so the check and balance is also be embraced fundamentally, which is prime tool to ensure against dictatorship. So, as I said, the historical context offers some point of use and understanding to compare and can usually enable us to see the true nature of institutions and creation of some legal system. Okay, and we have the comments from Professor Sampson also. Once a year, the monarchy makes contact with democracy in the extraordinary ritual of state, opening of parliament, where officials parade in fancy dress, leaders of the opposition process 2 by 2 with government ministers, and the queen reads out the speech which the government has written for her. It can still amaze foreign visitors and infuriate radical members of parliament. It's like the prisoner of agenda, complained Richard Crossman in 1967, but not nearly as smart as or well done as would be at Hollywood. It's more what a real Ruthianian would look like, for far more comic, more untidy, more homely, less grand. But the ritual still illustrates the basis of British Constitution. The sovereignty of monarchs has passed to the sovereignty of Parliament, leaving the monarchy with the trapping of powers, while prime ministers are still denied the kind of pomp that is accorded to American and French presidents. The dignified role of the crown in the Constitution mingles with the efficient role of Parliament and the executive. So we can see distinct dualism between symbolic and a practicality. Parliament is the obvious starting point for pursuing what Orion Biban called the will, or the wisp of power. But does Parliament still belong to the efficient part, or has it joined the monarchy as merely one piece of dignified power, leaving the real power to be wielded in Whitehall or elsewhere? So, that will be all in brief about the structure of a political branch in Great Britain. So now we turn to see part of a judicial structure. When courts of system are studied, the tendency is to focus upon the traditional or regular course of law, where criminal or civil proceeding occurs. So that is also the case for England. And in general, the English system is understood in a very complicated a context over decentralization of court system. That predicament was saved by the institution of the Supreme Court in 1873. The Supreme Court of Judicature Acts was legislated to address the integration in coherent fashion of a judicial system. And 1 century later, England enacted the Courts Act in 1971. So minor changes was added, and some of reforms was achieved to modernize the judicial system. And as I've introduced, the Norman Conquest has imposed a significance in terms of a judicial system, also along with the political restructuring of England. And the historical wake of evolution also enables us to see this unique context of court system. For example, the Magisterial Code and some delicate hierarchy in a court ladder encompassing a High Court and Court of Appeal and Crown Court. And particularly you can see one distinct organs, what I call a Judicial Committee of Private Counsel, which addressed the issues arising from the Commonwealth context. So the forms and styles of adjudication is also different in private counsel, since they are not empowered to file a dissenting opinion, unlike domestic courts or across most jurisdictions. For example, we also allow a dissenting or concurring opinions from the justices, but in some of certain contexts, the private counsel is required to file only the court opinion, which is a majority, of course. But many of special courts are restrictive in scope of power, and actually the extent of engagement is rather diminished in many contexts. And your first work should be shared on focus of ordinary code, as in other cases, and particularly the public law area is very similarly designed to comply with a vast jurisdiction, including Korea. So it is very interesting to see some of a keen development in terms of its special dealings by public law, but they actually do not have the separate court system, unlike France, which goes the same to Korea. We have no separate dealings, but we have tribunals within the administrative branch, special tribunals, which have the power to review the disposition or decree or orders of executive officers. But it is intrinsically possess the nature of administration. It is not a judicial business, and their decision can be finally appealed to the line of a court system, but they have no independent court, unlike France. And also, one point notable about court system should go to a majestic court. As I've said, the lay judges execute their judicial business to address the minor criminal matters. So special courts and tribunals, or administrative hearing bodies, receive comparatively a scant attention in usual course of dealings in common law system, but they are not actually so, as we see. In common law systems, where the judicial process leads to the event of trial, this emphasis is even stronger, because people attend these events much as they might attend the play or the cinema. The tradition of the English courts exaggerates this focus, but we want to make inquiry into where the largest number of decisions are made regarding people's everyday lives, then the administrative tribunals assume their proper importance. There are less instances of the development of common law than the development of advanced societies with complex governmental structures. The civil law nations in Europe reflect the parallel development in the use of administrative tribunals. We nevertheless are drawn to the ordinary courts to outline the way in which disputes are resolved. They may be undergoing a process of chipping away at their jurisdiction, but they are where most major civil and criminal events continue to be resolved. Our interest in the courts of England will focus on several issues. Some outline of the ordinary courts is necessary to illustrate how England has structured these courts over the years. As Chapter on history has suggested, they are very much a product of sequential events since the Norman conquest. They have changed very slowly. We might expect, therefore, that many of their characteristics reflect historic moments in developments which have flowed from the currents of times. The English court system evolved from just such currents. The desire of king to hear matters of importance to the crown, and the concern of the barons that they consequently lose both power and revenue by such a transfer to the developing central court. The English courts evolved through the centuries to serve perceived needs, at least those perceived by persons in authority. In the late 19th century, the system was refined by the Supreme Court of Judicature Acts, 1873. Nearly a century later, some modest restructuring occurred with the passage of the Courts Act, 1971. So, we'll need to be further on introduction, but actually, I'd like to make a point about some distinctive elements found between two major jurisdictions in view of a communal context between U.S. and English court system, which seem to be partially pertinent to our case in Korea. Extensive use of lay judges for minor criminal matters in majestic courts. That is the case for England. Usually, most jurisdictions negate this kind of concept. Constitutionally, it is required to utilize a qualified judges, set forth in essence about their qualification. For example, some untainted criminal record, or some basic education, or power passage, or the kind of qualification. And the more active participation of judges in court proceedings. That is distinctive, but myself goodness of public needs. How do you perceive the practice of Korean judges? Are they faithful and earnest, or have enthusiasm or activism in administering the justice? The comparative minor use of juries in civil trials. So it is a point of contrast with the United States. Of course, we now import the jury trial, but how we practice the jury system should be monitored more closely to see its progress, actually. The less adversary nature of proceedings. So, what does it mean? Then the court proceedings may be more inquisitive or assertive, but they should not be extreme and should be eclectic to incorporate the modern liberal concepts. The colorful ceremonial trappings of court dress. It is a matter of style, but enable us to have some reminiscence or some reflection about the pattern of a practice. Okay, we'll get further after short break. I'll return soon.